Backstage нэвтрүүлгийн өнөөдрийн дугаараар Америкийн нэгдсэн улсын Колумбийн их сургуулийн Зүүн Азийн урлаг хэл шинжлэлийн тэнхимийн багш, шинжлэх ухааны доктор, Монгол улсын их сургуулийн хүндэт доктор, Монгол судлаач Морис Росаби оролцож байна.
So I read that you are an Egyptian who moved to the United States at an earlier age, and you're a historian and scholar now who's working in the Columbia University. I read that you're working in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. And what do you specialize in teaching now?
Well, I teach both Chinese history and Mongolian history. It took quite a while to convince the department that I'm in that we ought to teach Mongolian history, but I was able finally about 20 years ago to convince them, and so we've been teaching Mongolian history for about 20 years.
Oh, wow.
We have mostly for undergraduate students, but I've had some marvelous students who have come to Mongolia, some gotten PhDs, and not in history so much, but in anthropology. They are very interested in shamanism in Mongolia, in the kinds of environmental issues that Mongolia faces, and so I've been very lucky to have had very good students.
Good to hear.
Yeah, well.
So you were a writer or editor for many books, over 20 of them, mostly specializing in history of Central Asia, right?
That's right.
So when I was reading about you, I was wondering, how did it all start? You know, you're an Egyptian in the United States,
right,
and you're studying and researching about Central Asia and Mongolia. So how did it all start?
Well, it all started, I always knew I wanted to be in foreign affairs, foreign studies, but the Middle East was too close to home. I knew too much about it and wanted to explore different areas. And just at that time, China was fascinating Americans in a variety of different ways. We couldn't go there at that time, and so it aroused my interest. I started taking Chinese language, and then when I did my doctorate, I was one of the few people who knew both East Asian languages, Chinese and Japanese, and Middle Eastern languages. And so Central Asia seemed a natural area of research and study, and I was fascinated by it. And I still, I'm still interested in China. And then in the 80s, early 1980s, I was looking around and realized there'd never been a biography of Kublai Khan, one of the greatest figures in world history. Because I wanted to deal with the rather negative image that the Mongols have in the United States and the West. The Mongols, of course, did not have a written language, and so the writings, the contemporary writings about the Mongols, are from the people that they subjugated. And they're portrayed as barbaric, portrayed as rapists, massacres, destruction of civilization. And I didn't want to deny that, but I wanted to point out that the Mongols had a tremendous impact on Eurasian history, on bringing Europe and Asia together at a time in the 13th century when they had been separated and had no contact for centuries. So in a sense, the Mongol era witnesses the beginning of global history. So I started doing it, and it was important that I have both the East Asian and Middle Eastern languages, because the sources were Persian and Chinese. And wrote a book, and that got me more into Mongolia.
Yeah, you wrote a book on Yuan dynasty and the China and Mongolia. Right. Right? And
that's
also I read that you wrote about Kublai Khan and about his time and life.
Right.
And also you wrote about the modern Mongols.
That's right.
So that's a pretty long span of time that you studied.
Time span.
Yeah, so do you feel much Mongolian about yourself?
In a sense, yes, I do. Maybe I'm not a I'm a little bit too old to be a pastoral nomad, but wandering around. But I'm a kind of a nomad. I've been traveled from Egypt to the United States and over the years to Taiwan, China, Japan, all over the world, and I've enjoyed travel. So in that sense, I feel some emotional attachment to nomadism, and Mongolia is the center of pastoral nomadism. And of course, I've, over the years, particularly since 1994, have met extraordinary Mongolians, people who become friends, and I came in 1994 to see if the Soros Foundation could play a role in Mongolia, and we met a variety of different people over a month-long period. I suggested that Mr. Soros start the foundation. He finally did in 1996, and one of my students became the head of it for 6 years. So ever since then, I've been coming to Mongolia quite frequently, and that led to a book on modern Mongolia, and led to books on, eventually on Mongolian art. Another book is coming out this year on Mongolian posters, communist period. So it's been a wonderful experience getting to know all of these great book, Mongolians.
Right, the book of yours, The Modern Mongolian, it says from Khan's era to communism to capitalism now. So could you tell us a little bit about the book itself, the content of it?
Well, the book focused on some of the advantages and some of the disadvantages that occurred and problems that occurred after 1990. I think many of the problems arose from a quick transition, overly quick transition from socialism to capitalism, socialism to the market economy, in a kind of shock therapy that was practiced at that time, and it harmed Mongolia. It struck me. The foreign advisors who came struck me as not really knowing much about Mongolian culture, and demanded rather dramatic changes in Mongolia. And the result has been some difficulties for Mongolia in the transition period.
Very interesting. So you said it harmed in a way, right? So how do you see it? Like, if you take an example, how would you picture it? The Westerners coming in, consulting us to, you know, for the transition from communism to capitalism. So, what's the harm you?
Well, I saw that they did not know much about herding. They mostly stayed in the Western advisors mostly stayed in the cities, and were focusing on market economy, and were sort of condescending, it struck me, towards very intelligent Mongolian people. They also, as part of the neoliberal ideas of that time period, they opposed too much government involvement in the economy and culture and the arts. And it struck me that was a mistake. I think the government has a role to play. And then the cutbacks in education, medicine. I think one of the best parts of the socialist period was education and health. And the cutbacks in those created problems.
Okay, thank you. So you wrote that book in 2005.
That's correct.
Right. So how many times have you come to Mongolia since then?
Oh, at least every year.
Every year?
Yeah.
Do you see any improvement in that regard from then, now, about, it's almost a decade, a little over a decade. So do you see any improvement, or do you see anything else?
Well,
in that direction?
certainly the improvements in the city are quite remarkable. The new buildings, the lifestyle changes for some people. Notice washing machines, people having washing machines. The public buses somewhat better than they used to be. but there are also a lot of people who aren't profiting from the changes that have occurred. It's the same in the United States. We have the same problems. Income inequality is still a major problem here and nearly everywhere in the world.
Guess,
and I'm hoping that one of my hopes is that somehow income inequality diminishes over the next decade, as it has not in the past decades in Mongolia or the United States. That's
So the common people of Mongolia, including me, myself, know few, would you say Mongolists or historian about Mongolia, right? And that I know, for example, Jack Weatherford, and I've read about Boris Vladimirtsov.
Vladimirtsov and Genghis Khan.
Right. So do you have any influence from other scholars and historians who study Mongolia?
Yeah, there are some wonderful historians who studied Mongolia. Charles Borden, great English Mongolist, really knew the language of the Mongols, studied Mongolia very well. Jack Weatherford, to my mind, is a kind of not a great historian. He is a popularizer and made some outrageous factual mistakes. And so I'm not a fan of his. But there are some serious scholars of Mongolia. Chris Atwood, now at the University of Pennsylvania, is a very able historian, and they're wonderful anthropologists at Cambridge University. So there are people. Mongolia, I've always said in the past 10 years or so, Mongolia is a wonderful place for scholars to do research. It's not like China where there are limitations on some research. But the number of programs in Mongol studies has actually diminished in the United States and in Europe. Bonn University used to have a big program in Germany, mostly gone. The University of California at Berkeley.
Why do you think that is happening?
I don't understand it. I just don't understand it because the opportunities are great for young graduate students to do research in anthropology, do research on economics, economic development, on history. Mongols played a very important role in history of the world. And
I would like to think so.
yeah, they did. There's no question about it. But, you know, people go to the areas where there are jobs, academic jobs. If you're going to hire somebody in Asian studies in the United States, you're going to hire somebody, a specialist on China or Japan. Very unlikely you'll hire somebody on Mongolia or Vietnam or
the developing countries.
the developing countries. You'll focus more on the big countries.
Yeah.
It's too bad. From my standpoint, it's too bad.
Okay. Well, it's kind of sad to hear that the study on Mongolia, on us, on our history, is diminishing. It's kind of heartbreaking, really.
It is very sad for me to see it because I get some wonderful students who might consider a career on Mongolia, but there are just so few jobs in academics that they don't do it.
So for people who are maybe now watching our interview and also who are watching from abroad, what kind of books would you suggest for the readers to read on study of Mongolia?
Well, I think one of the best ways to understand the impact of the Mongols in traditional times is looking at the artwork. And there have been wonderful exhibitions over the past 20 years at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, at the Cleveland Museum of Art, in European places. And so there are a lot of these catalogs. One that I would recommend is something called The Legacy of Genghis Khan, which had nothing to do with Genghis Khan, but it showed the role that the Mongols played in transmitting artistic motifs across Asia. It was a show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Another I hate to push my own book, but I've got a book called The Mongols, a very short introduction, which is part of the Oxford University Press series, which gives a very, within 100 pages, 120 pages or so, so in a variety of subjects, an introduction. Introduction, in this case, to the Mongol Empire.
Yeah, I read short summary of that book, and it looks great. I think that somebody who doesn't know about the country will get a little bit of understanding of the country.
Basic understanding, not a sophisticated, but but that helps. It's a good start. It's a good start for most people. So, and there are scholars who write, you know, more complicated, more demanding kinds of books, and those that, you know, when you reach a certain stage, you can begin reading other works. So, a lot of good books on the Mongols.
So, looking at your books, it seems that the study of yours covers a broad territory of Asia, and mainly, I guess, China and Mongolia. So, I wonder, from your perspective, what's the difference between Mongolians and Chinese in terms of civilization? So we like to think ourselves as nomads, and we like to see Chinese as others, like more civilized,
more sedentary
population. So what's the difference between us?
Well,
and them?
I think you know, I wouldn't call the Chinese only as civilized. The Mongolians are very civilized as well. It's just different patterns of economy that prevailed in both countries. A more freer kind of lifestyle as embodied in Mongolia, nomadic pastoralism with not as much of a centralized government as was the case in China. I find Mongolians, and you know, I know there are tensions often between Mongolians and Chinese, but I find both people very, the people I come across with good senses of humor, intelligent, and really sophisticated. I know the Mongols resent China for certain political reasons. The Chinese refer to the Mongols in a condescending way, and you know, it's too bad, because the Mongolians I know are extraordinarily sophisticated. I would say some of them brilliant, knowing a lot of different foreign languages, and so misunderstandings between the two are unfortunate from my standpoint.
Okay, so for individual people, do you see any differences?
Sure.
We're you know, next to each other. We've been neighbors for
to survive,
you know,
somehow
many years, of course. So yeah, what's the difference between?
I think one of the things I notice when I leave Mongolia and go to China is the difference in noise level.
Noise?
Noise level. China is much noisier and than Mongolia, and the Chinese are more commercially minded. When you go to a market, the Chinese approach you with all sorts of products. Mongolia, that never happens. You go into a store and nobody bothers you, nobody approaches you. The Chinese are much more commercially minded, and I wouldn't say aggressive, but that's one aspect of it. Senses of humor are different too. Very different. But you know, it's not something that's irreparable. There are opportunities for both to shine. I hope that happens.
Okay, so now we've come to the last question. Last couple of questions, two more questions. So I have friends who graduated the Columbia University who are now working in the field, you know, in politics, also in businesses. It's a very respected school. So have you taught any Mongolian at the Columbia College University?
Oh, many.
Many, yeah?
Many. We had quite a few of them that were brought by quite a few Mongolians who were brought by the Soros Foundation in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And they may not have been involved in history, which is my field, but they often took my course because it was one of the few courses on the Mongols at Columbia. People in economic development, people who were focusing on education, they want to be educators, social work, and so on, quite a few. And now undergraduates, it's a brilliant undergraduate who just graduated a year ago, now pursuing a PhD in very demanding biology, esoteric form of biology. So I've been pleased with the Mongols
Great to hear.
I've had.
So are you in contact with the graduates? Are you in touch with the alumni here?
I don't do not in touch with the Alumni Association, but I know quite a few of the Mongols who have been students. I've also had faculty members who've come and I've been their mentor, let's see, 3 from the National University of Mongolia. Two historians, 1 economist. No, actually 4. And someone in international relations who are now faculty members at the university. But I'm beginning to get undergraduates who come and are very good. Excellent.
It's really nice to hear.
Yeah. Well, it's very difficult to get into undergraduate school at Columbia. Only 6% are admitted, so they have to be very good.
Yeah, they have to be. Is there any difference between Mongolian students and the other countries or American students?
I think there's, in some cases, greater pressure to succeed among the Mongolian students because they realize they've been given an opportunity that's not available to everybody else, and so they work very, very hard. And the American students who obviously also work, but they do very well. They realize that this is a great chance, and
it's not any. I think it's much of a luck and really hard work being admitted to that school.
To the
general,
school,
right?
and so they value it and prize education a lot, and some of them are very patriotic. They want to go back to Mongolia with good skills that will help the country. So that's been very pleasant, really nice.
It's really great to hear.
Yeah.
So one very last question. Now I think there are a couple of issues, so not really issues, people are talking about the Silk Road and Silk Road itself, the history about the Silk Road.
Right.
And Mongolians like to own the idea of Silk Road, and of course we think the Chinese would like to own the idea of Silk Road. I think all the countries who were, involved in Silk Road would like to get the, like we invented all that in the history-wise. So, what do you see? Do you see any important position or any influence from Mongolian side to the Silk Road?
Well, of course, in the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mongols were great supporters of trade, and that led to a remarkable development of the Silk Road. There had been, the Silk Road developed earlier, but it never been as important and as many people involved as during the 13th and 14th centuries. The Silk Road started really as a defensive measure on the part of the Chinese. They were being plagued by a nomadic group called the Xiongnu, who were probably the ancestor of the Huns, around the 2nd century BC. And they thought of sending an ambassador to groups in Central Asia to initiate an attack on the Xiongnu, one group coming from the west and the Chinese coming from the south. They sent an envoy there. The envoy was captured by the Xiongnu for a while, went on and escaped, went on to the Central Asia and was flatly rejected. The alliance was flatly rejected. Came back, and you'd think the embassy was a failure. But in fact, he brought back reports about so-called blood-sweating horses. One of the things that the Chinese were desperately in need of was good horses. They needed horses for their cavalry. They never were able to breed them. And on the other hand, he had brought silk to this group in Central Asia, which they realized they could use themselves and also transship to areas farther west and do very well in trade. And so that was the real origin in the 2nd century BC. The result was a considerable amount of contact between Europe, Iran, and China during that time period, and trade paved the way for extensive cultural contacts as well. Possibly the economic significance of the Mongol period was not as important as the cultural, technological, scientific that was brought about by the Mongols, artistic as well. The Mongols also were much greater supporters of merchants than the Chinese. Chinese traditionally thought of merchants as kind of parasites and placed them at a very low social level. So the Mongols did improve the status of merchants, and that led to the great flowering of the Silk Road in the 13th and 14th century. So everyone contributed, not just Chinese or Persians.
Or just Mongolians,
or Mongolians,
right?
Everybody did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. It's my pleasure having you here in Mongolia and approving our request to talk with us on VTV. So we'd like to wish you all the best, and please come back again and
hope to.
write good books about Mongolia, and please don't stop studying on Mongolia. Like, you know, we don't want to diminish the study on our country. So
great.
I intend to.
Thank you.
On behalf of all Mongolians, on what you do, and take a safe trip back home.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care. Yeah.